Forgiveness is one of the most identifiable teachings of Jesus, and also the most controversial and maybe the least followed. Jesus gets in trouble for forgiving people. Not only that, he even gets in trouble for just hanging out with sinners. Everyone wants forgiveness for themselves, but we're not too sure we want it for others. And too often in church, we take the role of that grudgeful older brother and the prodigal son who wants just a little bit more accountability, maybe even just a little more suffering for his brother to make sure that his repentance is real. The bottom line is we don't know if we can trust forgiveness. How do we know that someone isn't just taking advantage of us? Does justice fall apart if we just run around forgiving everyone, especially if we don't think they're truly repentant? And how can we, just mere mortals, be so broad and high-minded as to forgive? Can't we just let God kind of sort it all out? I have a lot of complicated emotions around forgiveness and reconciliation. On the one hand, I truly believe in the power of it. It's an essential element of my faith, and I have experienced moments of reconciliation that have made my life better. On the plus side, many wounds after my divorce have healed. It took a lot of therapy, learning to love again, letting go of hard feelings, and it also took honest communication with friends and family who were willing to engage the work with me, who wanted a better future than we had. And to be honest, it's not always perfect. Old wounds still hurt, but it is better, even good most of the time. And on the other hand, some relationships still remain raw, even after 20 or more years. Those wounds don't distort my daily life anymore, but then the pain is touched and the anger flares and it's all there in front of me again. Some attempts at reconciliation just didn't work. I think I did my best, but it takes two sides. Both sides willing to do the work, willing to have some self-reflection in order to come to reconciliation. And I decided in these cases, if I could just be cordial in public and do no harm, well, maybe that's good enough sometimes. We can live with a forgiving heart, a heart that doesn't close to the possibilities, but sometimes reconciliation isn't there yet. We can't control the outcomes. So this week I developed a working definition of what forgiveness is for myself. And I think forgiveness is moving on a path. It's moving on a path to wholeness and to healing after we've experienced a moral and relational injury. And notice in this definition of forgiveness, I don't include reconciliation. To me, that's the next process, and it may or may not happen. And in my definition, the word path carries a lot of weight. Forgiveness is not a transaction. It's not a legal thing that settles a question. Forgiveness is a journey that we take. If you think of how it is when you have a wound, healing takes time. It often leaves a scar, maybe even a limp. So my first hope from forgiveness is the well-being of the wounded. The second hope is for reconciliation where possible. Sometimes it's not, and sometimes we have to be careful. We wouldn't want to force reconciliation in a situation of abuse or violence and do more damage than is already done. There's a lot out there, kind of self-help, forgiveness in 3 easy steps. None of it's easy. Healing a soul is as complicated as healing the beating human heart. In cardiac medicine, we need surgeons and we need cardiologists and dietitians and physical rehab. And likewise, in healing the human soul, it requires love and wonder and kind support and therapy and the perspective of time and the presence of God, all of it doing its part. And when we look at the teachings that Jesus gave in today's reading from Matthew, we see he's trying to give us some advice. What do you do when a relationship is faltering? Well, first you go to the person. You talk to them in private. You deal with it as soon as possible and don't get a bunch of other people involved through triangulation and complaining. Great advice. Solve it early. If that doesn't work, you may need the counsel of a wise friend, Jesus says. Maybe even some mediation between the two of you. And if that doesn't work, it starts to become a community problem and has to be dealt with in a bigger process. And then he says, if there's a person who refuses to reconcile, treat them like a Gentile and a tax collector. And of course, Jesus ate with Gentiles and tax collectors, so we're still not really completely off the hook, are we? So Peter thinks he gets it. He's always eager to tell Jesus that he's on the right track. And he says, Jesus, how many times should I forgive? As many as, say, 7 times? And Peter's saying this, he's seeing himself as quite magnanimous and enlightened, because everybody knows in the Old Testament law, you only had to try 3 times. He's stretching for 7. And he expects Jesus to, well done, Peter. But Jesus says, no, Peter. Forgive 70 times 7. What? Are you kidding me? Have you met my neighbor, my sibling, my parents, and see how terrible they are? What do you mean? 70 times 7, that would take a lifetime. How can we possibly do something so impossible? Well, Jesus didn't just pull that number out of the air. In the early part of Genesis, there's the story of Lamech. Lamech is attacked and he's wounded and he kills the man in self-defense, and he doesn't want any retaliation, and so he boasts, anyone who tries to harm me shall suffer vengeance 70 times 7. Jesus is reversing the vengeance of Lamech, turning it upside down. And what I hear Jesus saying is, you need to work as hard at reconciliation as others do at violence. I like some of the Old Testament stories around forgiveness and reconciliation because they're complicated, because they don't make it simple. And the story of Joseph and his brothers is just, it's gold. We would call that family today a little dysfunctional. The brothers don't like Joseph. He's precocious, maybe a little arrogant. He's the 11th of 12 brothers, and they get tired of him, and they sell him to a passing caravan. We all have our sibling fantasies. Years later, the family migrates to Egypt during a time of famine, and Joseph has become the Pharaoh's right-hand man. And after all these years, they don't recognize the grown man, Joseph, and Joseph decides he's going to put them through a series of tests. He's just going to rush out and forgive them for nothing. You know, they sold him into slavery. First, he accuses them of maybe being foreign spies. Puts a little fear in their heart. And then he says, I am going to hold hostage the youngest brother, the one who the father loves the most. And then one of the brothers steps forward and says, take me instead. And this self-sacrifice, this offering, something about that touches Joseph's heart. He decides maybe there is some good in my brothers, and he reveals himself to his brothers tearfully, saying, I am your brother Joseph. And he goes and he hugs each one of them and kisses them and says, you have refuge here in the land of Egypt. And he says to his brothers, you sold me for evil, but God meant it for good. And I notice that he names the wrong. What you did was pretty evil, but there's a higher purpose. God has used that evil and brought it to good. There's more than vengeance. So if we stop here, we think this is a pretty remarkable story of forgiveness and reconciliation, but it's not done yet. Things shift when the father dies. And the brothers fear that Joseph was only being good to them out of respect for the father. So they take action because they think that Joseph really is vengeful. Now he's going to retaliate, even though he looks like a good guy, but deep down he's still harboring that grudge, they think. Maybe they haven't dealt with their guilt, their shame at what they had done. They act out of fear, and so they construct a lie. They send a messenger, and they say, your father told us before he died that he wanted you to forgive us. They play the dad card. And Joseph hears this, and he begins to weep. Maybe he wonders, didn't I show enough goodness towards them? Don't they believe that I forgave them? How much more would I have to do to prove to them that I intended good? And he realizes his brothers, they fear him more than they love him. And it breaks his heart. And it reminds us again, forgiveness is not a transaction. It's not a one and done thing. Sometimes you have to keep coming back to it and working it as things change. And then the brothers come and they don't help the situation. They come and they say, oh, we'll be your slave, anything, don't kill us. And of course, if Joseph was a spiteful man, this would be just gold, right? But he stays philosophical and he says, don't be afraid. Am I going to sit in the place of God and judge you? Yes, you intended harm to me. God intended it for good. And I'm tempted to say, all's well that ends well, right? That they finally get there, but I'm not so sure. It's messy. Joseph has done a lot to forgive. He's withheld his anger, his vengeance. He's not taking the place that belongs to God. He's shown good, honest intentions. But did the brothers ever reach the place of reconciliation? They never once admit the truth. Never once in the story do they say, "We are sorry for what we did to you. That was a terrible thing. We were young and stupid. Forgive us." Joseph does all the work. And no one can accomplish reconciliation by themselves. Getting it right about forgiveness is a commitment to take a path, a journey. The deeper the wound, the steeper the climb, the more courage it takes to offer it. And we can learn from those who have made the steepest climbs. And I think of Bishop Desmond Tutu as one of the most important voices in the world for forgiveness and reconciliation. After apartheid in South Africa, people carried very deep wounds, personal wounds, systemic woundedness on scale. And Tutu chaired what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a bold attempt at healing and justice on a society-wide level. And what the commission did is they offered the possibility of amnesty for those who committed violence if they would tell the truth, the whole truth, in public. And Tutu listened to years of harrowing testimony of what happened in apartheid. And then he wrote a book titled, No Future Without Forgiveness. And his argument wasn't that forgiveness is this wonderful, high-minded, utopian, good thing to do. He said it's pragmatic. It offers a future that if we don't have this moral and spiritual struggle for healing, then the only outcome is continued violence and retribution. He understood there's no reconciliation without truth. That a victim needs to hear the truth to fully reconcile, but also a perpetrator needs the opportunity to reclaim their broken humanity. And this process, it didn't create perfect justice. It didn't heal every human soul. And many people criticized the amnesty as letting murderers go free. And South Africa, of course, has carried the burdens of apartheid for decades. But some people took the opportunity. They faced their crimes. They told the victims' families what they had done. And some chose to reconcile and forgive. Thousands of people healed enough to move forward with their lives and try to build a new future for their country because of this opportunity. And I wonder where South Africa would be if this was not attempted, most likely spiraling into further violence and trauma. The people climbed a mountain. They were supported by leaders of faith like Bishop Tutu. And we can take lessons from it, whether our burdens are great or even just one difficult relationship. We need a power greater than ourselves to guide us. And I think of the story in Luke. Jesus is nearing the cross and he hears the crowds. They're screaming at him. And he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And what I hear in those words is Jesus himself needed a higher power, a strength that was bigger than him to heal what was coming and the brokenness in the human heart. We can't be rushed. We can't be coerced to forgive. It's risky. It's vulnerable. It requires support. But what forgiveness can do is it can interrupt the cycle of harm. It can loosen the grip of the past. And it can leave us open to something that the past can't give us: a future. Amen.